Good evening. Welcome to the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh. My name is Alison Tierney, and it's my privilege to be introducing and chairing this event, which is part of the college's series of History of Medicine lectures. The history of medicine here in Edinburgh is long and distinguished, and this evening's lecture on nurses and doctors from 1660 to 1820 will take us way back to the era of the Restoration. Midway during that period, Edinburgh's infirmary began operating, and near the beginning, in 1681, the charter was granted by Charles II for the establishment of this Royal College of Physicians. So some interesting connections. My attachment is not to this college, but to the Royal College of Nursing, of which I am a fellow. And it was Rachel Forrest, who coordinates these events, who thought to invite the FRCN to provide the chairperson for this lecture, because it's about nurses as well as doctors. And that was a very welcome invitation that I hope might lead to a closer alliance between our two colleges. It was really for that reason that I agreed to take up the invitation to chair this lecture, despite some real trepidation about being in this auspicious place, but also on account of my complete ignorance of pre-Nightingale history. I do, however, know a thing or two about uneasy alliances between medicine and nursing. I spent most of my career in the Department of Nursing Studies at the University of Edinburgh, the department having been established there in 1956. However, the idea of bringing nurse education into that ancient and then male-dominated university was met with vociferous opposition, in particular from the Faculty of Medicine. And 4 decades later, by which time I held a personal research chair and the headship of nursing studies, I failed to persuade the high Hegians in the Faculty of Medicine that with a new millennium in the offing, it surely was time to link nursing and medicine at the University of Edinburgh. And so I defected to Australia to head up nursing at the University of Adelaide, which I knew as a visiting prof, and where a strong alliance between nursing and medicine is embedded not only in the structures, but in the psyche. But let me move on, because we're here to learn about what was going on between nurses and doctors in times long ago. Before I introduce our lecturer, a few housekeeping announcements. I feel I should do this like strictly, really fast. First, no fire drills are expected, so if an alarm goes off, please make your way to the signposted fire exits. Secondly, after the lecture, which will be about 40 minutes long, we will open the floor to questions, so please hold on to your questions until then. And finally, this lecture is being recorded to add to the others on the college's YouTube channel for on-demand viewing. Only the speaker and the screen are recorded, not the audience or the Q&A. And now to introduce Professor Alannah Tomkins. On behalf of the college and everyone here tonight, it's a real pleasure to welcome you, Alannah. Not a nurse or a doctor, but an eminent historian. And from doing some reading homework, I also discovered that Alannah is a great writer and storyteller. And I think that's a skill derived from the fact that your first degree was a dual degree in history and English at Keele University, where you graduated in 1991 with first-class honours. After postgraduate study in history at Oxford University, Alannah returned to Keele, first as a lecturer, and in 2017, she was promoted to her current position of Professor of Early Modern History. Professor Tomkins has published extensively on various medical history topics, including poor law and workhouses and asylums, and the admission of overworked physicians to these facilities, and also on the history of nursing. Her 2017 book, Medical Misadventures in an Age of Professionalisation, 1780 to 1890, explored the turbulent careers of medics who wanted to become fully qualified, but who were held back through bankruptcy or accusation of patient neglect or stress-induced illness. In 2018, Alannah led a 3-year project funded by the Research Council entitled Small Bills and Petty Finance, drawing on little-used sources of handwritten overseers' vouchers and receipts to uncover the socio-economic bond between those paid by the parish, such as midwives, and the poor who received their goods and services. And a new book comes out in January, published by Manchester University Press, titled Nursing the English from Plague to Peterloo, 1665 to 1820. And it is from this book that Alannah has drawn her lecture tonight, Nurses and Doctors, 1660 to 1820, An Uneasy Alliance. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Alannah Tomkins.
Thank you to Alison for that lovely introduction. Yes, this is thank you, Alison. This is a paper which essentially I've garnered by selecting pieces from throughout the book that will come out. I was saying in the run-up to this, when we were talking before the lecture started, that in trying to write this book, I was not able to draw on any single set of sources or materials. It was like, I've characterised it as being like trying to make a king-size quilt out of postage stamp-sized pieces of cloth, because I would find lots and lots of little bits of things and have to try and find a pattern when I put them together. So what I'm going to be doing this evening is talking through this broad structure. So alluding to the ways in which the relationships between doctors and nurses prior to the nursing reforms of the 1850s have been stereotyped by contemporaries, by contemporary practitioners, and by historians subsequently. I'm going to sketch out some of the ways in which historical reality was more varied, by talking first of all about the mutual reliances which could emerge between nurses and doctors, those circumstances in which doctors proffered praise to nurses versus those in which they found it necessary to criticise their female colleagues, and then concluding with what I have to say is probably the most substantive bit of the talk, which is what did the nurses think about their status in these settings where they were working in parallel to medical practitioners. So that's the outline, and Alison's going to give me a 10-minute warning, so if I overrun, I can be brought to heel. So first of all, nursing stereotypes from the point of view of the doctors in this, it has to be said, pretty expansive period. So I have adopted about 170 years or 160 years to cover. And on the whole, I would say that the statements which doctors made in a public fashion about the nurses they worked with were derogatory. Women were dismissed as ignorant and meddling. I should say that there is a chapter in the book about male nurses, but I'm talking only today about the female nurses. As you can see, quotes from across the late 17th and the mid-18th century give this indication of women as being dismissed as meddling and ignorant. Now, the historian Margaret Pelling, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and she's one of mine, she has argued that female nurses appeared dangerously independent to male practitioners across this period, and that doctors might have feared competition from nurses. In other words, that although nurses didn't enjoy medical training, they did have perhaps more protracted, maybe even constant access to their patients, and therefore perhaps had some sway over their patients. And of course, in this period, both doctors and nurses were commercial actors. They were paid fees for their work. So the risk was, Pelling imagines, that male practitioners might have been afraid that they would somehow lose fees because patients would rely on nurses rather than on them. I particularly like, I don't mean I like it, I particularly appreciated in a negative sort of way when I came across these comments by William Brownrigg. He can't bring himself to use the word nurse. He refers to old wives and bystanders. He just can't even bring himself to use the word nurse. The stereotypes continue among patients. This is a quote which, if I gave you the full print of the picture, which is on this slide, you would have the full text of this reprobation, which sits underneath this image. This was a picture published by Thomas Rowlandson in the early 19th century, where essentially he was summing up all of the negative experiences which patients feared they would have when they paid nurses to care for them. In other words, this caricature sums up all of those things that patients worried about. They worried about dependency, they worried about helplessness and vulnerability at the hands of nurses who perhaps didn't have their own best interest at heart. Patients worried about losing their sense of autonomy. They were worried about being imprisoned in their own homes. The idea that illness imprisons you was by no means new when Rowlandson published this image, incidentally in a series called The Miseries of Life. It was well known. There are medical writers in the late 17th century who describe illness as potentially imprisoning people. What's interesting amongst all of these stereotypical headline comments from amongst the pool of patients, as opposed to physicians, is that nobody gives much concern to the risk to nurses. In other words, if patients are nursing contagious patients, nobody gives much thought to the risks to the nurse of contracting their patient's illness. Nursing historians have unfortunately picked up on some of these stereotypes and run with them. So even as recently as Carol Helmstadter's book in 2020, and I like Carol's work very much, but she similarly castigates the nurses prior to the 1850s for their terrible reputation and drink being their besetting sin. And you'll notice perhaps that this sense of nurses in sobriety is somewhat at odds with the stereotypes that I raised in the earlier two slides in relation to doctors and to patients. And I think that's not just because I've been awkward and chosen quotes which don't illustrate what is the case. I think this illustrates the dangers when historians write about nursing history solely with the reforms of the 1850s and later in mind. In other words, if you take the narrative of the reformers as being both true and as always having been true, then you assume that all nurses prior to those reforming efforts were essentially drunk. But if you look at the words of contemporaries, you can find that people's fears actually range more widely, so we're not solely concerned with alcohol consumption. And there are the glimmers, even before I started my research on this book, there were the glimmers of hope that perhaps nursing history prior to the reforms of the 1850s was beginning to emerge from the doldrums, because at the first event that I attended in this vein, so the UK Association for the History of Nursing had a research colloquium at Chester in, I think it was 2017, and 17 or 18. And I was delighted to hear a paper by Erin Spinney, who started to talk about her own research focused on naval nurses. I'm not going to be talking about nurses in the Navy, but that's where her research concentrates, about the ways in which women were compensated and valued for their work, even if sometimes they didn't necessarily behave themselves perfectly. They were, after all, human, but she was starting to point the way to viewing nurses more positively, and I was really reassured to learn that, so I wasn't ploughing a lonely furrow. So the reality being more varied. In speaking to this slide, I'm talking about domestic nurses. That's to say women who, between the late 17th and the early 19th century, were employed on an individual basis to nurse people in their own homes, for a fee, and they might be living in those homes or they might be coming to them on a daily basis, but they would be receiving money for their work. And these women who came in and assisted in people's domestic settings, there was a suspicion. There are a couple of published quotes which suggest that from the outside, that is to say from the point of view of the patients versus all medical practitioners or all health workers, that nurses might be identified as, quote, the tutored creatures, unquote, of doctors. In other words, that they were somehow perpetrating whatever treatments the doctor was urging, possibly in the teeth of patient interests. And in the 1730s, there's another thread of evidence about nurses, to the effect that nurses could be characterised as gossiping the skill of the physician across the parish. In other words, that somehow nurses acted as a kind of advertising network for medical practitioners. Now, these relationships, these filaments of hints about the way in which people felt about nurses or construed their relationship with doctors are complicated by the fact that doctors were themselves sometimes nurses. So men, for example, who were medical practitioners might nurse their own families. We know this from those occasional moments where you just get a sliver of insight into what's going on in people's houses. So, for example, Susanna Wedgwood, the mother of Susanna Darwin, née Wedgwood, who was the mother of Charles Darwin, was married to Robert Waring Darwin, who was a physician in Shropshire. And in one of her letters, she refers to the fact that she has to nurse their children, which were numerous, on her own because the doctor was absent. So in other words, we get this kind of negative piece of evidence that the doctor, had he been present, would have helped her to nurse the children. So we get these little shreds of complication that help us to start to problematise these stereotypes about the relationships between doctors and nurses. Nurses, when you look hard enough, can be found being valued by doctors and patients for their familiarity, for example, with dangerous illnesses, which might otherwise have left patients at their own devices. So the historian Ian Mortimer has argued that physicians shunned plague victims, for example. In other words, that plague victims were more likely to be nursing-assisted than medical practitioner-assisted. And similarly, in cases of smallpox, Margaret Pelling, again, has noted the, quote, guarded approval, unquote, given to women who had lots of experience of nursing during smallpox and who did their work thoughtfully and well. One medical writer even went so far as to say, a skillful nurse can cure this distemper without a physician. That's smallpox. He said that in 1712. So, whoa, I shouldn't think he was very popular amongst his medical colleagues. But there we go, an allegation that smallpox could be cured by nurses as well as by doctors. Nurses were also valued for their attendance on corpses, partly for the company in the house and partly because they might be instrumental in unexpected recoveries. So even so unlikely a person perhaps as Thomas Sydenham, dubbed the English Hippocrates, was once credited a nurse with saving a patient's life because they'd apparently died from smallpox. They were placed on a table under a sheet, and the nurse thought that she detected signs of life remaining, so she had this patient put back into bed and revived them. Thomas Sydenham. So the credit where credit was due, as it turned out. The best example I could find of this came from the Collier family, which was a family based in Hastings in Sussex. I'm afraid a lot of my examples come from a long way from here, so I apologise for the sometimes what might look like an emphasis on the south of England, but I assure you it's just coincidence. The letters that went back and forth between members of the Collier family in the early 1730s illustrate this set of relationships in a more sort of extended and profound way. Essentially, the two sons of the family, John and James Collier, they'd been born in 1719 and 1721 respectively, and they were packed off to school in London, which I suspect was not all that uncommon for children in wealthy families. In the later months of 1732, they were at school in London and living in the house of their maternal uncle, William Cranston. John. He was removed to lodgings. It was quite usual to remove people who were thought to be contagious to the lodging houses where people were willing to have contagious people brought. He went to the house of a Mrs. Canham, who was a mantua maker, and unfortunately John died within a week. The family was devastated, but the death wasn't in any way blamed on the attending nurse, who was described by the uncle of the boys as recommended by the apothecary and seemed to me, this is to say William Cranston, for I carefully examined her motions, doesn't mean evacuations, it means the way she conducted her business, to be a person of judgment and humanity, and very diligent in attending upon him. Both this nurse and Nurse Davis, who sat up with him, another nurse, were given a pair of white gloves at the time of John's funeral. So Davis, the sitting up at night nurse, was particularly valued in Mrs. Canham's house for the fact that Mrs. Canham felt, quote, so long as the corpse remained in her house, she and the children and the servants were afraid of going past the room that it was in. Then James, the younger of the brother, also fell ill with smallpox in January, and of course the family was grieving and desperate to find every form of assistance for him. They sought another lodging, trying 3 or 4 places before finding that Mrs. Canham was willing to take James as well. Perhaps surprisingly then, James was carried to the same lodging that had proved so unfortunate for his brother, and from which John's body was swiftly removed, for what could have been more melancholy than to have one child dead and another in a doubtful condition in the same house. James's case was quickly pronounced by the physician to be more favourable than his brother's, but he still needed a nurse, and the letters which flew between London and Hastings in the January of 1733 illustrate the family's satisfaction with this nurse, yet also indicate their susceptibility to the negative stereotypes. From the outset of James's care, his nurse's character was approved and her experience acknowledged. She was judged a good, understanding, careful woman, indulgent and kind, and well liked by her young patient, James himself. When the doctor ordered a form of enema, called a clyster, William Cranston consulted both with his friend William Page, who was a lawyer, and with the nurse about whether or not the enema should be given to the boy. And William wrote in his letter, "We thought very happy and concluded to send to forbid the glyster," unquote. That's really interesting, isn't it? The nurse's voice was allowed to join the voice of the uncle and the lawyer to reject the treatment recommended by the physician, and so contradicting the attending doctor. The trust placed in her did not change because she did not allow her attention to her patient to slip. The uncle said, "She has taken a great deal of care of him. She's the same as at first." Her activities, some of which we might anticipate, like giving him medicines. She was trusted to have drugs at hand, but also slightly unusually, he developed hair lice when he was in bed, and so she had to comb out the lice as well. There was a substantial social difference between the nurses who worked for these 2 little boys in London and the family home in Hastings, because John and James's father was a lawyer who was, I think on multiple occasions, elected as mayor of Hastings. And when he came to visit them, he was perhaps unsurprisingly rather sneering about James's nurse. So the father of these 2 boys wrote, "I went today to the house and saw the old nurse, who is just such a piece as one would imagine." In other words, the first characteristics he noted about the woman were her age and her imaginable traits, by implication from the negative nursing stereotype. Even so, he was compelled to add, "but I believe very careful," and humours him very much. In other words, this emotionally invested father did not otherwise remark on the inherent contradictions in his reaction to this lowly paid nurse. Then there's the issue of mutual reliance. And in this, speaking to this slide and later ones, I'm mostly going to be talking about institutional nurses. So nurses in, that is to say, in the London hospitals of Barts and St Thomas's, and in the provincial infirmaries which sprang up across England in the 18th century. In these settings, if there was a problem, if there was any kind of problem that when the doctors were not present, nurses had to take the initiative, and sometimes when they took the initiative, problems arose. Because there was an assumption that nurses could make poultices and apply leeches for bloodletting and applying blisters, which are a way of kind of bringing the humours to the surface. That's a whole other story. But dosing was another matter. So, for example, in the Shropshire Infirmary, there was a nurse called Sarah who was dismissed at the request of the surgeon, or one of the surgeons in 1783, for having given opiates to one of his patients. This was not indicative of a hard line between whether or not nurses should be dosing patients with opiates. Because in other contexts, so for example, William Buchan, who may be a name that's familiar to you, he was the author of Domestic Medicine, which was a kind of bestseller of home medicine in the second half of the 18th century. He wrote in one of his publications, not Domestic Medicine actually, but another book, "Bark and laudanum are now prescribed everywhere by nurses and mistresses of families with safety and advantage. I would rather trust myself in the hand of an experienced nurse than of a theoretical physician." So what were nurses supposed to do when they noticed patients were under changing circumstances in the absence of the medical man? They could take the initiative, but there was a spectrum of behaviour which was allowable and not allowable, and it could shift depending on the personnel in the infirmary at any one time. So this was a kind of double bind that these women suffered under. Doctors relied on the nurses' reports on patients. There were some procedures that were so lengthy that required doctors to be present, but most of the time it was the female nurses who stayed with patients, sat up with them at night, not the medical men who were not always present. Thomas Fowler was a physician in the Stafford Infirmary in the second half of the 18th century, and he wrote a number of books about the medical advantages of tobacco and bloodletting and arsenic, believe it or not. Only one of these works mentions the presence of an infirmary nurse, in this case applying leeches, but he certainly relied on the women more often than this single reference suggests. But they just don't get the credit for the reporting on the patients that they inevitably did. Across all of this research, I was quite dismayed to find so few references at all to nurses amongst the writings of medical practitioners. One of the few unguarded writers who does refer to nurses is a medical student, a man called Hampton Weeks, whose letters have been edited as a supplement to the journal Medical History. And if you read that very carefully, I don't think they're indexed, but if you read it very carefully, you can find little references to nurses. So in the August of 1801, Hampton Weeks wrote to his father, another medical practitioner, about his experience of basically walking the wards at St Thomas's Hospital in London. He told his father that it was the attending nurse on one of his patients who had discovered a key symptom in the patient, in this case actually a child with a swollen abdomen. Now, that didn't which altered the treatment regime. Unfortunately, the child didn't survive, but Hampton Weeks noticed that the nurse should be credited with having recognised this change of symptoms. But this was unusual, very unusual in male medical practitioners' writings. Doctors, of course, employed nurses. So, for example, I'm afraid I'm going back to Sussex, so I apologise. But there was a Dr. Smith, genealogists in the audience, feel my pain. A Dr. Smith of Horsham in Sussex, who ran an inoculating house and recruited a nurse to attend the patients there, which suggests he valued what she was doing, but he never said so. The surgeon apothecary Matthew Flinders of Lincolnshire, whose his diaries and account books have been published by historians for the 1780s, reported that his own daughter had fallen ill with measles while away from home, and she was kindly nursed by a woman in the house where she was placed. Hampton Weeks again, going back to St Thomas's Hospital in 1801, he wrote home in November 1801 about his friend and fellow lodger, William Attry. He said, "Poor Attry has been very ill indeed, with spasms of the right arm, coming on as Cooper and Dr. Fordyce think from dissecting." It was notorious that sometimes medical practitioners and medical students could fall very ill indeed or even die as a result of a small cut they occasioned when conducting a dissection on a cadaver. He's always been subject to spasm in the chest. He has one of the sisters of the hospital sit up with him these 3 or 4 nights past. So let's just think about that. There's a medical student saying that another medical student's been ill, and one of the sisters of the hospital has left her own ward, or been told to leave her own ward, and is nursing one of the students at the hospital. And the medical student who's writing the letter does not object. He doesn't say, "How dreadful to be subjected to this drunken woman." No. There is nothing of that character in Hampton Weeks' letters. Instead, he keeps track of who's nursing his friend, William Attry. The following January, Attry still required nursing, but by then he'd resorted to a paid nurse who was apparently in the house day and night, according to his friend Hampton, at what Weeks anticipated would cost a smart penny. In other words, this was a perk of being a student at St Thomas's. You got nursing from the nursing sisters in the hospital. When Dr. George Fordyce himself was dying the following year, Weeks noted again, one of our sisters are constantly there to nurse him. On none of these occasions did he express any regret or concern about the need to use hospital sisters in this way. Presumably when the women were taken away from their customary duties on the wards, his only concern was about the cost of a private paid nurse, not her drunkenness. And in the book, I sketch out a couple of other possible sources of reliance in relation to mutual expertise and shared trauma. Now, this is more tenuous, I grant you, but for both women and men working in the Chelsea Hospital and catering for old soldiers, there was the capacity for a kind of a specialism to develop. It certainly developed for medical practitioners, so one of the major interventions in geriatric illness publication in the 19th century came out in 1863, published by the then physician to Chelsea Hospital. So I can't prove it, but I suspect that the nurses who looked after these bodies that were getting older and perhaps suffering from long-term disability or wounding were also developing expertise as well. There's a big argument about whether or not you can detect trauma in the past before something like PTSD has been defined by medical professionals. You'll have to read my chapter 6 to see whether you agree with me. I think we can detect signs of trauma, and that sometimes medical practitioners in their battlefield memoirs leave evidence of this, of things being too horrible to describe, and that's the surgeons find it too horrible to describe. But nurses don't tend to leave memoirs, so we have to find the signs of their trauma in other sources. But that's in the longer book. Praise versus criticism. The criteria for the good nurse were published at some length in 1730, and they do tend to suggest that medical practitioners could conceptualise the ideal nurse. There's a lovely intro to this. Though it is impossible to meet with a nurse every way so qualified for the business as to have no faults or failings, i.e. she's human, something which medical practitioners themselves were not necessarily always willing to admit, it's desirable that she be of middle age, fit and able to undertake, go through with the necessary fatigue of her undertaking, so fatiguing, healthy, free from vapours, a good watcher, can hold sitting up the whole course of the sickness. Now that seems to suggest sitting up multiple nights in a row while the patient is still ill, quick of hearing, quiet and still so as to talk low and tread softly, of good sight, handy to do everything the best way without blundering and noise, clean, well-tempered, cheerful, pleasant, constantly careful. Rule 13, sober and temperate. So he does mention sobriety, but it's not necessarily front and centre. For God's sake, don't let her drink. So there are some signs that these attributes, that doctors hoped that they could secure these attributes. And in fact, there's also some little threads of evidence that they found them. So, for example, ploughing through the journals of Bart's Hospital in London, in the Bart's archives, you find evidence that surgeons and physicians might support women's applications to obtain places as nurses and sisters in the hospital. The hospital was always a bit worried that these women were a bit poor and they might then become paupers and then might come begging to the hospital. So sometimes physicians and surgeons stepped up to ensure the hospital didn't face this future risk. None other than the august surgeon Percival Pott indemnified the hospital against the risk of financial loss when it employed Sarah Mansell as a nurse, and his signed affidavit is still in the hospital archive. Practitioners supported rewards for nurses when they thought their work had been done well. In 1792, the Lincoln Medical Society held a charitable assembly for the benefit of Elizabeth Scholey, a poor older woman who had formerly worked as a nurse at the Lincoln County Hospital. They raised 20 guineas for her. They also defended hospital sisters when those women were criticised from outside. So, for example, at Barts in 1749, Mary Vaughan and Sarah Field, who were both sisters of different wards, were dismissed for using ill language and unmannerly behaviour towards the porter and steward. Now, Sarah Field was allowed to go without any protest, but the surgeons of the hospital, petitioned for Mary Vaughan to get her job back as a very sober person and very diligent and careful in her ward. And she got her job back. And this isn't the only one. The minutes are peppered with more examples of this kind of defence. So hospital physicians and surgeons valued individual nurses, defended them when it came to the point they had to, but they were quite quick to resort back to the stereotypical dismissive criticism if anything went wrong. So, for example, there was an example of a kind of a newspaper report of the death of a patient, Henry Jessard, in 1805, apparently after a fatal dose of laudanum was given to him by the nurse, a mistake which was blamed on the women's unlettered ignorance, rather than on the practice of domestic dosing with dangerous substances, for example. So there was this impulse, if anything went wrong, to go back to the familiar stories of criticism. But if you look beyond those, you can find some more evidence. And that's where I'm going to move to my story of what the nurses thought. But these women rarely wrote about their experiences. There's almost no memoirs, for example, of these women's experiences. There's one newspaper interview. I cheered when I found that. In February 1807, Barts Hospital played a bit part in a public catastrophe. There was a hanging taking place in London, and such a crowd gathered to witness the hanging that the crush became uncontrollable. Over 40 people were smothered or trampled to death, and many more were, quote, terribly bruised. The dead and injured alike were taken to Barts, where one of the wards called Elizabeth Ward was given over to act as a kind of temporary morgue, and others of the wards took emergency admissions. The Morning Post interviewed 3 of the men admitted to King Ward, and the journalists also interviewed the unnamed sister of King Ward, who was described as about 56, low in stature but of robust constitution and perfectly collected. She'd been caught up in the events outside the hospital but escaped injury herself, and she was said to be much elated in having experienced such a wonderful escape. But it doesn't really tell us much more about the woman herself or what she thought. What I have detected, though, in looking at all of the records of these provincial infirmaries, is battles over chamber pots, which suggest that the nurses did not regard themselves as the competitors of doctors. They regarded themselves as the competitors of patients. And this is because in the rules of the 18th century infirmary, nurses, there were very few, there's very little in the way of job description, but one of the rules was that for patients, and that was that ambulant patients should help the nurses perform their duties. In other words, the nurse on a ward was in charge of the ward, but not in charge of all of the patients in the manner of a more modern conception of nursing on a hospital ward. And what you find happening across infirmaries throughout England, amongst populations of women who have no means, as far as I can tell, of communicating with each other, is that they're working in settings where they're not distinguished from their patients by any real means. There's no costume difference. They may share the same diet. They may be the same people. Some women who are admitted to hospital as patients then become nurses. So there's literally no social difference between patients and their nurses. And so nurses develop a strategy for drawing lines between them. In other words, for saying, we are here in a position of authority, you are not. And they do this by levying a small charge for chamber pots. This is completely contrary to the rules of the hospital. They're not supposed to take money from patients at all, but in hospital after hospital across England, when a new patient arrives, they're asked for 3p by the nurse for the chamber pot. In other words, to supply a fresh one and to empty it regularly. Now, what's particularly striking about this is that when the hospitals twig what the nurses are doing, they're horrified that patients are being asked for money, but they don't sack the nurses. So what they do instead is they say, well, these have become customary payments, so we must now meet the payments that otherwise patients have to make. So, for example, in the Gloucester Infirmary, when the Gloucester governors of the infirmary discover that the nurses are levying this charge, they'd say, oh, well, we'll pay that now. You know, patients don't have to pay it, but you've been used to getting it, so we'll pay it. Why? Why don't they sack the nurses? I argue in the book that hospital governors are beginning to suspect that nurses are in a very difficult position socially. They're required to be authoritative, but they're also marginal by virtue of their gender, their age, and their social status. And that hospital governors are beginning dimly to recognise that perhaps this threepenny charge was, if not allowed by the rules, understandable. In Gloucester, there's a particularly interesting denouement to this, which is years after the threepenny rule has been, you know, the governors are paying the money to the nurses instead. You get an interesting minute in the minute book, which says, nurses must supply a chamber pot immediately to the patient, the new patients, which strongly suggests that even after the threepenny charge has been removed, because the hospital is paying this, the chamber pots are still being part of a power play on the ward between nurses and patients. Yes, I am your nurse. Yes, I'm getting money to empty your chamber pot. It's dirty work. How do I still maintain my sense of self, my sense of identity, my sense of authority over you? I can delay the arrival of the chamber pot. So I think it may be an uncomfortable way to conclude the lecture. Uncomfortable. I've been advised before, don't finish on chamber pots, but I think they're integral, so I'm going to finish on them anyway. It may be an uncomfortable update on the historiography of the pre-Nightingale nurse, which doesn't reflect terribly well if what you wanted was a history which continues to talk about great men and great women and enormous change. But I do think this situation, what I've sketched out, helps to start to understand the behaviour and the demeanour of nurses before nursing reform, and perhaps helps us to understand that they weren't all drunk and incompetent forever before reform came along. It was a changing scene, and that it's worthwhile trying to unpick some of the aspects of that changing scene. But the core thing to take away from it is that doctors relied on nurses when it suited them to do so. Doctors benefited from doctor support when it was away from the public eye. And that drunken incompetence may have attracted a lot of attention, but the majority of women worked well, with cursory or no training at all, at least until the requirements for nurses become more stringent in the 1820s and onwards. But that's another story. Thank you.